So as normal, let me welcome you to our partner forum. This is more an intimate affair. We hope you enjoy it. And as we were discussing, Jonathan and I, just before, the nature of these events has changed post-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, it's a lot easier to get a lot of people out to these sorts of events in large forums, but actually it's proving very, very much more difficult these days. And so these more intimate events seem to be more appropriate. And what we're discussing today is affecting literally everyone. I'm sure everybody is concerned about it, and that's the cost of living crisis. We seem to be living in perpetual crisis over the last 2 or 3 years. COVID hasn't really disappeared. A recession seems to be looming over the horizon. We've got a war that is actively impacting energy prices and various other things, supply chains that we have at the moment. And all of this is creating a kind of a perfect storm for people that work in businesses, but also businesses themselves. So the question, if you like, today, for our very eminent panel, is to think through, well, what are the moral obligations, if any, of businesses? And what are the good practices? What are the positive things that businesses can do to help their staff and employees get through this difficult time? And hopefully through that, we'll capture those and we'll document those and share them with our partners and supporters and abroad, hopefully, as well. So I'm absolutely delighted my name is Gleave, I'm one of the directors of Ethical Reading, and I'm absolutely delighted to have a very eminent panel. We've got Paul Hargreaves, the CEO of Cotswold Fayre, but he's not just CEO. Paul is passionate about the social enterprise and using business as a force for good. So I'll get Paul to describe in his own words some of the things that he's been up to and what he's been doing. So, and that applies to each of the panelists actually. So, when it's your turn to come on, as it were, please do expand on who you are, what you do, and your role. We've also got Jonathan. We're delighted to have Jonathan, who's a partner here at Shoosmiths, and we're very grateful for Shoosmiths for allowing us to use this space. Once again, thank you very much for that, Jonathan. That's fantastic. And Shoosmiths have been our partner from day one, actually right from the beginning, which is fantastic. We're also delighted to have Stephen Raffield. And the Reading Police have also been our partner, with Malta right from the beginning as well. And Stephen has just taken, I think not too long ago, taken over as commander of Reading Police. So we're delighted to have Stephen with us to give his perspective. And of course, Fraser Gleave, from the Citizen Advice Bureau. It's quite often in difficult times, the first port of call for the average person is the CAB. So we're delighted to have Fraser with us as well. We couldn't do what we do without our partners and supporters, many of whom are represented here. So just a quick shout out to them and recognition of the support that they provide. Quick word on Ethical Reading. So we've been going since about 2018. We're a not-for-profit social enterprise. Our mission is to encourage and embed ethical behaviour inside organisations, inside and also in terms of how they connect with the local community. We want to inspire organisations, individuals, so they can make better decisions, more ethical decisions. We want to provide the tools to enable them to do that through events like this and through training that we provide. And we firmly believe in collaboration, working together to achieve those goals. We hope that over time in Reading we can create a kind of a template for an ethical city, and then we want to export that to other places. We hope it's taken up. So that's our sort of broader vision, if you like. So today is literally the welcome and introduction. So I'm going to hand over now to Paul to set the scene, if you like, in terms of his thoughts and perspectives around the cost of living crisis, and then we'll go through the panel and I'll pose specific questions to each of the panelists. We'll have a bit of a discussion after that, and we'll open up for general Q&A thereafter. So these are the rough timings. Don't hold me to it, but hopefully,
Check that.
we're pretty much there. So we're pretty much on time at the moment. So, as a socially focused entrepreneur and business leader, but you've also written a couple of books as well, including fantastic Forces for Good. What are the moral obligations, do you think, if any, of businesses to help staff through these difficult times? And from your perspective, what are you doing in Cotswold Fayre to help your staff and employees? What are you doing differently? And do you have any thoughts and ideas that you think other organisations could pick up from that?
Lots of questions. I think it's really important we get onto the practical stuff we can do as businesses. But before we get onto that, I want to talk about the systemic side of things. So I believe business should be a catalyst for positive change in society. For far too long, businesses have been doing the opposite of that. And a lot of the social and environmental problems we have, sadly, is our fault if we're running a business. Either, now currently or, as part of the business community, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, we have basically been agents for negative change rather than agents for positive change. So I think there's a massive onus on business to make a positive difference, if only to repair some of the damage that we've done over the last 200 or 300 years. I totally agree with Gurpreet that constant crises are here to stay. I don't think there'll be a time when there aren't crises. So sorry, folks, we need to get used to it. In fact, since you've organised this meeting, the cost of living crisis has got considerably worse. So the timing couldn't be better or worse, depending on which way you look at it. We have a massive systemic problem though, because what is perceived as normal actually is, if we took a step back or if someone came from another planet to see what we're doing, they would just think it's completely and utterly mad. So, little experiment, first of all. Who's got an Apple phone? Okay. Well, not your fault. I'm applying personal blame. But you are I'm obviously, I haven't got an Apple, but I've got another phone that would probably have the same impact. But by buying into brands like that, we're perpetuating inequality. You would have heard in the news last year about the pay award to Tim Cook, CEO. $99 million per year. So I did a bit of a calculation and worked out how long the average Apple employee would have to work to earn $99 million. They would have had to start working in 545, what's it called now? Not AD, is it? BC, yeah. What's that? 1,500 years. Every year to earn what he earned in 1 year. Now, that's an extreme example, and it's probably slightly worse, well, it is worse in the USA than here, but it's still pretty bad here. I mean, the CEO of Bet365, which is definitely a business that's making society far worse, she awarded herself £360 million pay deal last year, or the year before maybe. No, they are extreme examples, but the average FTSE 250 ratio of CEO's pay to average pay is 300. It's gone down slightly in the last couple of years, but still around 300 times. For people going for those jobs, their perception is that's normal. It's not normal. And I personally think it's completely wrong. What do we think a good ratio would be? Well, people would expect people with more responsibility to get paid more, for sure. If you ask them, definitely. But those kind of multiples are just perpetuating this horrible inequality we have. And the UK is one of the most unequal countries in the world. There's a really good book quite an old book now, written by Richard Wilkinson, called The Spirit Level. And it looks at, I mean, they're sociologists, massive amount of data about measures of society, number of people in prison, teenage pregnancies, mental health, crime, all that stuff. There's about 12 different measures, and they are all worse in the most unequal countries. So the least unequal countries are far, far better for everyone in that society. The rich people included, it's better for them too, because the houses are getting burgled less. Yet we have this very unequal situation here, which obviously when you get to a crunch like we're in at the moment, just makes everything far, far worse. The top 1% earners in the UK were paying 10% tax, so that's a kind of benchmark of how much they're earning. They're now paying 29% of the tax in the UK, and tax has probably gone down for them. So I strongly believe, I mean, injustice and inequality are one of my main drivers in life, i.e. reversing that. So I have always tried to run a business that did whatever we could to reverse the injustices and inequality in society. And clearly they're not perfect, and there's loads more we can do. But for us, that's one of our main drivers. Our multiple, by the way, just for transparency, is 3.8. So we're a B Corp. Who's heard of B Corp? Anyone? Yeah. So we are measured on how good we are for the world. There are now 1,000 B Corps in the UK. How you treat your workers is a kind of key pillar of the assessment, as is environment, engagement with the local community, and then governance and customers. So to be a B Corp, you have to be good in a certain number of areas. You don't need to be perfect, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be one. But we've always been good on the workers' side. When we first certified, we changed nothing and got a really good score on that. So, but the strange thing here is, and I'm sure everyone in the room gets this, but why has anyone thought that it wasn't a good idea to make the people that work for you as happy as possible, to give yourself a good company? I mean, I remember when the government living wage came in, which isn't the real living wage. I'll go on to that later, but I had customers. So we're two businesses. We're a wholesaler of specialty foods by about 2,000 retailers across the UK. And then we've got our own retail and hospitality business. I remember quite a few of our farm shop customers complaining about the living wage when it came in. Now, don't want to fall out with the customers, but I did have one conversation with one of them. I said, why would you not want to pay someone enough to live on that works for you? How on what planet does that make any sense whatsoever? So treating your people well is, I mean, it's just, if you were not a totally amoral person, but wanted a good business, it would still be a good thing to do, wouldn't it? Why wouldn't you? Yeah, many businesses don't. It's maybe some of the other panellists can shed some light on why that's the case, but it's always been a complete mystery to me. So, yeah, there we go. So, in terms of practically, and do chip in, go for it if you want to drill down on any of this. So, yeah, I'm always in the situation where I want to do more than we can, and particularly in the retail and hospitality side. I mean, I think the living wage, we're members of the Living Wage Foundation, I'm sure most of you are, and that is currently just gone up to, what is it? Just gone up to £11 an hour, I think, for next year. I think that should be 15, if I'm honest, but certainly in our retail hospitality business, we can't possibly do that at the moment. So that's why this interlinking with the systemic change that we need to see has to be taken into account with this. But I think £15 an hour really is the minimum that anyone should get paid, and it's probably enough to live on. So we had a really so we decided one of the things we do, we have a care fund, which is a pot of money we've been paying into for years. And when people have to have extended time off work, either sickness or bereavement, we pay them out of this pot. Now, we haven't used that surprisingly during COVID. We didn't use it too much actually, but so we decided at our last meeting back in September that we were going to not give it all away, but we were going to give 2/3 of this pot away to everyone within the company to help through the cost of living crisis. That's the easy bit. The difficult bit and the ongoing debate, which was how to distribute that fairly. And we can distribute it evenly, but I would say that's probably not fair. So basically what I've done now is I've given each team a pot and left it to them. It's as a bit of an experiment. So, one team is basically said to the team, here's your money, I'm leaving the room, decide how that, and I quite like that actually. Maybe that's a model for the future. One team is just distributing absolutely equally. One is giving, not pro-ratering it, so the trouble is here, part-time, there's two types of part-time people. There are part-time people who can only work part-time because they have dependents to look after, and they probably need it more than anyone. And then there's part-time people who are really working to keep themselves busy, might have a partner who is the main breadwinner. So the two, same hours, totally different scenario. There is the sticking point, and how you do that. I think we have an HR lawyer next to me, so there's someone in this debate yesterday, someone said it was discriminatory not to do it equally. I don't believe that, but you might tell me differently. What else do we do? We share profits. We do generous bonuses. We give people time off if they need it. Pretty flexible like that. Generous holidays, because there's nothing worse for people with school-age kids. Fortunately, mine are all grown up now, where those long summer holidays and you really struggle for childcare if your employer only gives you that the minimum number of weeks a year. We do sabbaticals for people who've been there every 7 years, so they can have extra time off. Don't want to just go down a list, but yeah, I don't know if that's triggered any questions. Go for it.
Right, so
actually, one other thing. So I think the important thing here is a mindset shift. Difficult to say that at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so quite often a lot of our generosity as businesses has been, okay, what can we afford after all our other expenses? What can we give away to charity? Let's see how much profit we're going to make this year. And then if we've done okay, we'll give a bit away. And we sometimes do that a bit with our pay awards and how we treat our people, is working it out in our heads on an accounting type basis. Now, clearly, I'm not advocating financial suicide, but I do think we need to learn from the eastern countries in the world here about abundance. We're not very good at this in the West. And how the kind of principle of abundance goes in Hindu spirituality is that you operate from a place of abundance and generosity and then trust that that'll come back to you. Most religions in the world have a similar principle. So be generous, give, and it'll come back to you. And I think if we learn to do that as businesses, you'll get it back. And we've demonstrated that anyway with the people. I think this works for the environment as well. Companies that are being generous to the environment, being generous to their people, they will be the successful companies in terms of profitability. For me, that's just one measure of success. But I think if we learn to get into that generous, abundant mindset, we would have A, happier people, and B, better, more profitable businesses. If you analyse B Corps, which are generally better at this than other businesses, they actually are growing far, far faster than the average business in the UK. So only 1,000 companies is probably not a big enough data set yet. But I know from our experience, the more we've actually given away, the more profitable we've become, and therefore we can do more next year. We can open more retail outlets and do a lot more stuff and impact more people in a positive manner. So that's the reason I get up to work in the morning.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for that. So setting the scene there, Paul. I mean, I think, there's a lot of good ideas there, and good thoughts. It was interesting, I underline the comment that we decided, the we bit, and then you went on to say, well, you actually devolved that to the separate groups. That's an interesting way of saying, well, actually, the manager's probably closer. The groups are closer to individual circumstances.
Exactly. Yeah, that was the reasoning for it. Yeah.
So are you so in terms of the living wage versus minimum wage kind of debate, do you pay the living wage? Do you pay the £15? You said you reckon that's where it should be.
Well, I mean, in the wholesale, it's a different scenario. So wholesale is, we get more than £15. The retail and hospitality, there's a lot more unskilled workers in that environment, and we pay the living wage foundation wage. Love to do more, but it's such a competitive environment. I mean, talked about inflation at the beginning. Food and drink inflation 15%, so it's 5% more than the rest of it. So we've had massive pressure on. So this is still getting my head around this stuff, but we try and be as generous as possible, yet still have a business.
That's where we should we should work towards.
Yeah.
And in terms of, clearly you're the kind of culture and environment is kind of a listening, passionate culture. Is there kind of sort of formalism around that in some way that, you can, people feel comfortable coming up and talking to a body or a group, or is it just a culture that you develop, or is there a formalism listening and understanding people's difficult circumstances?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think probably pre-COVID, that was just very much endemic business. That's not the right word to use. Okay. Since then, we've had to engineer it a bit more. So we have actually started listening groups, which anyone who's a manager isn't allowed to go to. So fortunate in having two sites. So someone comes from the other sites to moderate those. In fact, we got one on Friday at the retail site. So there's someone in the business, but doesn't really know people as well. And hopefully that creates an opportunity for people to not hold back in terms of what they're sharing. So I think that kind of thing was happening naturally when everyone was in the wholesale business. People are in for 2 days. Obviously, the retail hospitality, everyone's in all the time anyway, so that's no change. But I think certainly for the wholesale business, we've had to engineer those opportunities for people to say. Well, we've always done anonymous surveys and stuff like that, which most people do. But I think sometimes you don't really get the nuances from those written down answers. So yes, these listening groups are proving to be quite a good way of really finding out what's going on with people's lives.
And that's particularly bad.
Yes.
Circumstances.
Yeah.
Come back to you. So I'm going to move on to Steve. So Steve, obviously from lots of studies, we know that there is correlation between tough times, poverty, reduced incomes, crime. So are we headed for a busier time for you and the police in general over the next few months? Does the nature of crime change in these circumstances? What does it mean for society more generally?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably quite a complicated question, actually. It's probably worth just kind of setting the scene on this a little bit. I mean, policing is for those of you that watch the news, is probably facing a really tough time. There's been some quite negative press around, I don't want to badmouth the Met, but let's be honest, the Met seem to attract quite a lot of bad publicity. I don't always think the public can make the distinction between Reading Police, Thames Valley Police, Met Police. It's just the police. So when something bad happens, it tends to have an impact on policing. So it's, like everybody else in business, public service has been through some similar challenges, out of the pandemic into kind of back to semi-normality, into the cost of living crisis. But policing has probably stayed relatively constant within that, I'd say. I think it's very difficult to say there's a direct correlation between recession, cost of living crisis and crime, because I think we won't necessarily see the effects of any increased crime immediately. There have been some studies around this, and actually, although you can say that poverty and cost of living, recession are risk factors in that, I don't think you can say that directly there will be an immediate increase in crime as a result of that. There are certain crime types that would cause me some concern at the moment. So I think, the crime we'd probably all be worried about as businesses is shoplifting. But I think what the evidence suggests is that actually, that there would probably be a slight shift in shoplifting practices towards kind of away from luxury goods towards kind of those essential items perhaps that people need. So shoplifting, I would expect to become more prevalent. I mean, Alexa will know this. I mean, it's not something that Thames Valley Police necessarily prioritise, which is again a bit of a controversial issue. I know that, but we generally prioritise things like knife crime for obvious reasons. In Reading, it's had some very bad publicity around that. We prioritise things like domestic abuse, violence. So shoplifting, although, I suppose my concern around this is that shoplifting can go slightly under the wire. And actually, would we notice necessarily increases in shoplifting like we would in other crime types? Would it kind of flag up and kind of present us with the same kind of headline figures? The other, I've mentioned already, domestic abuse. I mean, I think, what we saw during the pandemic was that although domestic abuse crime rates didn't increase like we perhaps would have expected, a lot of the other services perhaps saw some of that domestic abuse reporting that we didn't see. I mean, you've have probably seen that within Sisters Advice, and I know some of the charities would have seen this as well. Having said that, post-pandemic, the reports of domestic abuse have definitely been increasing. I would expect, and this is speculation, that domestic abuse crime rates would increase. I think, as people feel the bite of cost of living, perhaps some of that pressure will manifest itself behind closed doors. But I suppose the positive from this is that the correlation, I think, perhaps is between unemployment rates and crime, more so than kind of cost of living. And actually, unemployment rates are very low at the moment. They're the lowest they have been for, decades. And youth unemployment is also quite low. I think it's around just over 11%. And actually, the reading tends to suggest that actually, if youth unemployment rates are high, there's more of a prevalence for young people to enter crime as a career, if you like. So I think the fact that unemployment rates are currently low is probably a positive. Although I'm not sure around the stability of that, if I'm honest. I think, although the unemployment markets are low, I mean, I'd be guided probably by others in the room, but I think probably the unemployment market is quite unstable in terms of people moving from job to job. But when you get unemployment rates, I guess the competitive nature of employment goes up, and that can create a slightly different environment. The other kind of crime rates that I think are really challenging for policing are around fraud and scams. I mean, it is no secret policing is not well set up to deal with fraud. I'll ask a question, actually. So Thames Valley Police, big geographical area, 3 counties, largest non-metropolitan force in the country. What would who has an understanding of what our fraud team might look like? How many people?
10?
Yeah, it's not a bad guess. It's a small team of specialists. And when do you think, actually, I mean, as businesses, I guess, you'd be worried about the impact of fraud. Actually, your average cop on the street will have very limited skills in terms of dealing with fraud offences. So I think we've got some real challenges around skills and capability and technology that supports investigation of fraud.
What's the sorry, Steve,
That's okay.
what's the scale of that problem in the Thames Valley region?
I mean, we I guess it's not particularly visible to us in the Reading Police area because we don't focus on the stats particularly well. I mean, the process is it goes into an independent called Action Fraud. They decide whether there's anything there to investigate, and they farm it out to our investigation teams. Then it will, depending on what it is, it will go to either a frontline cop or to a specialist team or an investigator. But I mean, fraud is prevalent. I mean, what I think we'll find is that there'll be a prevalence of scams, and people will be, I think some of our most vulnerable in society will definitely be more susceptible to some of those scams as the cost of living crisis kind of bites. So I think, overall, I think what I'd say is that, yes, the obvious assessment to make would be as cost of living crisis bites, crime goes up exponentially. I don't think that's the evidence. I think we would see certain crime types increasing, but actually, I don't think it's as straightforward as that. I think it's a much more complex problem. And we touched on kind of acquisitive crime, which is kind of burglary, theft, that kind of crime. And actually, pandemic, that dropped right off. It's shown a small increase, but nothing like back to the levels that it was pre-pandemic, because more people are working from home, and actually the opportunity to commit that kind of crime is not there. So, not a straightforward answer, I think.
No, that's right. It's very interesting. So potentially, impact around domestic abuse.
Yeah.
And potentially around fraud and scams. Are there, from your perspective, what are things that businesses could do to ameliorate the impact potentially of crime? Is there something that I'm thinking, that's just awareness of how to manage debt.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think it's probably a social responsibility, isn't it, to kind of educate people in how to manage debt. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've only got to watch the adverts, I think, on TV, and every other one is about giving or taking part in online gambling or something. There's definitely an ethical responsibility there for businesses to kind of help people through. I think it'd be difficult. I mean, it would need to have some real thought put into it, I think, because actually to have an impact, it would have to be a real concerted effort to make sure the messaging is really clear around actually what do we want businesses to do to contribute to that. Wouldn't it?
Well, thanks very much, Steve. Again, we'll come back to you. So Fraser, you're in the front line in many ways, Citizen Advice Bureau. What are you seeing? What patterns, what differences are you seeing now? And again, if you can think about as well, what are the things perhaps that businesses might be able to help their employees with in terms of ameliorating some of the impacts of this crisis?
Yeah, definitely. Well, to start with the sorts of things we're seeing, I think probably very little of it will come as much of a surprise. So we've seen a huge spike in emergency help that people need. So that's things like food bank referrals, fuel vouchers to help people top up prepayment or just keep their credit meter going. Big increase in people needing additional help with benefit claims, particularly those who are sick or disabled. It's always been a big part of what we do, but I think, as cost of living starts to bite more, people who have these fixed incomes, if there is just anything that possibly could be out there to give them additional help, now is the time that they're coming forward to try and find out more about that, to try and increase whatever they can, wherever they can. And it's the scale of that that's really quite marked. So those areas, so food bank referrals, I'll use as a good example actually. We helped more people with food bank referrals in the first 3 months of this year than we did across the previous 2 years. And that's just a wildly exponential increase in the amount of people who need that level of help. Our top 5 inquiry areas combined in 2019 were fewer people being helped with them just with food bank referrals at the beginning of this year. And that's at the beginning of this year. That's not including everything that's happened over the summer and still happening. So it's the nature of our support is changing quite a bit, I would say. I think that the other issues that we typically used to deal with far more often, like, your average consumer problem, or, where's this bit of information that can help me with understanding should I be getting sick pay, and that sort of thing, what you would call slightly less complex advice from more capable clients, has really taken a big backseat, and I think that will have a knock-on effect that I'll mention in a second. But because that level of emergency support has increased so significantly, and there are so many more vulnerable people in need of help and whose issues are more complex as well, because the less money they have available, everything scales up with that. If you're needing to organise a food bank delivery or trip out there, figure out how you can just pay your energy bills and manage your rent arrears, that's an awful lot of work just to deal with, just to do your bare basics, let alone live your life and manage disability if that's your situation, or go to work. To be perfectly honest, we're seeing a huge increase in the people who are in work poverty, if that makes sense, because they just don't earn enough, even though they haven't cut their hours, their pay hasn't reduced, it may even have gone up slightly. But it's just not enough in the current situation, particularly families, particularly single parents as well. And I think somewhat surprisingly, single people with no dependents, actually, just having that one income and needing to sustain a rent, energy costs, food bills and that sort of thing with nobody to share it with, actually puts a huge amount of pressure on people. So again, you're typically looking at younger people or much older people, pensioners who perhaps now live alone, who've lost a partner or whatever's happened. So we're now starting to really kind of polarize the groups that we're seeing. So we're helping far more single people, younger people, older people, and very, very vulnerable people. So people with disabilities who've always been obviously a key part of who we've delivered to, but with complex issues as well. So as I say, you've got all of this stuff going on underneath, but problems with actually accessing benefits haven't got easier. That's still a challenge for lots of people, and actually in many ways it's got worse because government resources have been reduced, the challenges have increased for various agencies involved in these sorts of things as well. So a PIP claim, for example, something that we've always dealt with, something that we've always given a lot of help with, and reasonably specialist, just in terms of you kind of need to know what to say to kind of get the right outcome for that particular person, and that's why so many independent private claims fail, and then people turn to us for that sort of help. That's become so much more of a complicated process, because where it used to be sort of 3 to 4 months turnaround, it's now 6 to 7 months. And if you're going 7 months without an essential income and you're disabled, you have additional care needs and all of that sort of thing, and there's a cost of living crisis, that has that knock-on effect where you fall behind with your rent.
Sorry, can you explain that benefit?
Yeah, so PIP is personal independence payments. This is the main sickness benefit for working age people in England and Wales at the moment. So that's the demographic I'm thinking of, is people with a disability perhaps. It applies to in so many other circumstances, but as a good example, they need that income. They need, cost of living is biting harder. Everything goes less their money doesn't go quite as far. And so these are essential claims, and they always have been, but now more so than ever. But if you're waiting 7 months to hear back about an award, which you may or may not get, and might need to challenge, that's 7 months of, well, how do I pay my rent? How do I buy my food? How do I heat my home? Those sorts of things. And timing is relevant. The longer these things go on, the more it escalates. You might be able to get a bit of leeway with your landlord. You might be able to ignore a bill for a couple of months before you start getting final demands and full action and that sort of thing. But 7 months is well beyond that period in most circumstances. You don't have many landlords who are accepting 7 months of rent arrears. You don't have many energy companies who are accepting 7 months of energy arrears. That's just one example, but there are similar stories across the board with these sorts of things. And so that's where complexity scales up with just with how difficult these things are, and with that additional need and with additional cost does create that extra complexity. But I speak of the knock-on effect as well for people who aren't perhaps receiving help. So if we kind of go back 3 years, I say, pre-pandemic, a large part of what we were doing, I would say, in terms of numbers of people, it was probably about 60% of what we were doing, but in terms of time spent, probably only about 30%, kind of rough figures. A large part of what we were doing was helping with simple issues. People who kind of can look after themselves. They just need to know, where do I find this out? How do I understand this? What should I do about this? What are my options with this? And we used to do a huge amount of that work. People would just drop in off the street. We'd have a 15-minute session and we'd provide some information from our website, a quick leaflet, a quick bit of direction of, the council will deal with that. Just speak to them, for example. Just report that to action fraud, and we can deal with the other bits, that sort of thing. A lot of that work I don't think has gone away, but it's not the sort of work that we're really doing very much of anymore. We're so completely overwhelmed with all of these very desperate situations, very complex situations, that we're really not touching any of these other bits. And then that has the potential for those situations to then become these complex situations, which start to spiral out of control. Because if somebody had just early on known, if I just do this, if I just know how to do that and get on top of this now, it'll be sorted. But nobody can help me. I can't quite face figuring out perhaps. Or I don't really understand it. I've not quite found what I need. And then that escalates and it becomes a bigger problem. And then they become those people who are feeding into this group. So that pool of vulnerable or, very complex cases increases as well. And that's certainly something we're seeing, is cases where, when we're tracing back the history of what's happened to this person or with this person, you can see that there was a point in time where if we'd just spoken to them then and said, it's just, look here, do this, they're perfectly capable of doing that, it wouldn't have got to this stage. And again, that's something that's always existed, but it's just so much more of an issue now that we're doing so much less of that work. And again, the problems are amplified because of the cost of living. Falling behind on bills is so much harder to get back in front of it if your costs are also increasing at the same time. So I hope that kind of sums it up to a certain extent. Yeah.
Oh, done. So the kind of, what I get, the kind of sense of work that you're doing has shifted over time to a much more complex workload.
Yeah.
It's not just, provide some information and point you in the right direction. It's around helping them to navigate some quite complex applications and situations.
Yeah, and it's the intertwinedness of it. I think that's the thing, is if we, say 3 years ago, someone comes in, they're struggling a bit with money, but they're on top of things, but they have a sickness disability, help them make the PIP claim, and that's what we did. But now it's 7 months down the line and suddenly we're dealing with rent arrears, energy arrears, unable to afford food on top of all of that. That's now 4 issues where we previously had 1.
And most of the people, would you say that you're helping, are they in work? Are they still in work? What percentage are still working?
It's very hard for me to say. I don't know the exact figures, but I think there's a fairly even split on the whole in terms of the need. I wouldn't say that people with a sickness or a disability are in significantly more need than people who are in work. We're seeing still very large numbers of people who are in work but just don't earn enough. Claiming all of the right benefits, earning a reasonable wage for the job that they do, what we call reasonable, and what Paul talked about earlier probably throws that a little bit, but earning the market rate, shall we say, of what they should be earning, in their job, they're doing the hours that they can with the responsibilities that they have. It's just not enough.
Yeah. I mean, I think this comes back to your point, Paul, that you raised, that actually the living wage, even as it is now, is not sufficient, particularly given, when you look at inflation pressures at the moment, 10-11% and rising, it's very difficult in that situation. So even if you're in a job and doing the best that you can, if it's that sort of low level, you do have challenges around, paying your bills. So then it gets to, what about sort of debt management, things like that? Do you have people who provide that?
Yeah. So that's one of the services that we provide and have done for a long time. I think the nature of that has changed slightly as well. And again, it's all, cost is the main underlying issue with that. So, again, to throw a few sort of slightly arbitrary statistics at you. So, the sorts of people we were helping before the pandemic and now haven't really changed, but the situation that they're in has changed quite dramatically. So looking back a few years now, about 12% of everybody that we helped, by the time we've done a budget with them, we'd got any potential problem spending issues, is how you might want to refer to kind of, shopping too much or, that sort of thing. With that under control, a nice clean budget where, yes, this is what you can afford, this is what you have left over each month. About 12% of those, actually, they didn't have anything left over, or they were spending more than they had, and it was coming through by borrowing money from friends, family, credit cards, that sort of thing. That number has now increased to just under 60%. So more than half of the people that we do a budget with, we get to the end of that process and we say, well, we can perhaps do bankruptcy with you, you can have a debt relief order perhaps, and get a write-off for now. But immediately following that, your debts will increase again because you just don't have enough money coming in. And, we always used to talk about every debt problem has a solution, and to a certain extent it does, but not necessarily a permanent one. And that is what we're really acutely seeing now, is that there are so many people who we might be able to do something, we might be able to get some sort of a write-off, something temporary, but they will end up back in this position again through no fault of their own. This is us having literally been through their bank account with them and gone, you could get rid of that, couldn't you? You don't have to go to Bet365. And we do try to be realistic, make sure that people aren't cutting their budgets so far down that they're never going to stick to it and it's not really practical. We make sure that people have money to live on the essentials and to live a life, as far as they can.
Yeah.
But actually, as I say, more people, more often than not now, that's still not enough, and they will just end up back in that situation unless they get a windfall, they get a much better paid job, or something, one of these big life events that will really change their circumstances around. And again, sick and disabled people are much less likely to see that, because they have this fixed income. They can't do a new job, they can't retrain, they can't do all of these sorts of things that you would typically think of as being an additional source of income. But that is, to be honest, true of quite a lot of people. You don't have an opportunity to just kind of throw it all in and retrain and do a much better paid job necessarily. You've got other responsibilities as well.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Fraser. So Jonathan, turning to you, I mean, you've many years of HR experience and also sort of working, in terms of relationships, not only inside businesses, but also within, those people have family relationships. And as we've seen, the comments from Stephen, as well, that, there is a rise, or likely to be a rise in domestic abuse, and a lot of anxiety and stress caused by the cost of living crisis generally. What are the impacts you're seeing on your business as a result of this? What are your clients seeing as well?
Well, just listening to Fraser there, it's sadly it's not surprising, is it, as you said, but it is very sobering, I think, to hear that. And it, drawing on something that Paul said, actually, I think it's clear that businesses need to step up here, because, I mean, even if you discount the current soap opera at Westminster, which is transfixing our politicians, I'm not sure that Paul's philosophy of abundance, I don't know how that linked to, for example, the proposal that there wouldn't be a windfall tax on oil companies who had made massive profits in order to fund public spending. Equally, the first proposal, of course, long since reversed for the 45% tax rate to be abolished. Again, I'm not sure how that sits with the idea of this more equal society that, even at that top end, I mean, anecdotally, of course, people in that bracket of earning over 150,000 a year were saying, we were hearing stories saying, people saying, well, I don't want it. I just don't want it. And what good does it do me if all the public services are collapsing? You give me a bit extra in my personal pocket and I can't, the trains don't work, or I can't get a hospital appointment, or I can't see a GP. It's extraordinary that was thought a politically shrewd thing to even suggest, but there we are. I'll get off the soapbox and move on, but I'll move on. Sure. But in terms of, I think what that means for us as employers is we do need to step up and do what we can. And of course, every business will operate within its sector, within its demands that is placed on it, and they won't all be able to do the things that, for example, we might have done at Shoosmiths. I completely understand that. But I think it's incumbent on all of us to think about how we can provide that support. I mean, to give you just some very brief ideas of what we've done within Shoosmiths. Yes, there have been things on the financial side. Yes, we've done staff. Every employee was given £1,000 in September for the cost of living crisis, just as we're coming into autumn. We had a 3% thank you payment to all staff in May of 2022 in order to reflect back the efforts that everyone had put in over that last financial year. And the things like pay reviews been brought forward and so on. There are various things that we've been able to do to help on a financial basis, which has, I think been very welcome. And I think is really important to show that leadership. But I think more than that, we're looking at how we can provide that broader support. And I think, as Steve mentioned, there's an impact on families. He talked on the domestic violence, the potential threat those sorts of crimes might go up. We're looking at, and we have an employee assistance program. So there's a 24-hour helpline that people can phone. Part of that is on financial planning to try and help with that debt management, in order to make sure that employees either don't get into that situation in the first place, or if they're in it, they can be assisted. We're also members of the Living Wage Foundation, so those at least that minimum threshold is being met. I'm as an employment lawyer, I'm a passionate advocate in respect of hybrid working and flexible working, because that keeps people in employment. And really interesting to hear what was being said there about the link between unemployment and crime increasing. It's crucial. Flexible working, hybrid working helps maintain people in regular work when other things are going on in their lives that might otherwise have stopped them from continuing to work at all. So it's extremely important, I feel. We provide digital resources, advice, training, support for well-being and for financial planning as well. And so I think all of those things, that broader support network is extremely important. And then beyond that, really, the final strand I'll probably just pull on is in terms of our presence in our communities. Shoosmiths has a network of offices up and down the UK, and we really want to be engaged in that local community and to support organisations within it. So each office has a local charity partner. Here in Reading, we work with Number 5 Young People's Counselling, which of course has seen a huge amount of increased demand over the pandemic and since. We engage with Communicares, a local pro bono legal advice centre in East Reading, that we support those with some of the issues, because again, Citizens Advice Bureau is overwhelmed, as Fraser was saying. I mean, any source of support is really helpful. And, selfishly, I say that's good for our people too, because if they can provide that outreach, we encourage at least 1 day volunteering a year paid absence for all employees to undertake that. And of course, many do much more than that. So we want that because it develops them as well. It gives them an insight into a broader world outside whatever particular legal team they're working in, but it also provides that support in the community. So I think we just need to, as I say, different businesses will look at it in different ways. They will have different sectors, but I'm afraid it's clear that from a political point of view, we are the eye is off the ball here at the moment, so we need to step up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think we're ethical ready generally, and most of our partners, self-included, I think we're of the view that we can't rely on higher partners. The trickle down kind of impact or economics, that doesn't work. So we have to kind of we're firm believers in bottom up, middle out. And I think we need to do that. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jonathan. Just conscious of time, so I want to open up actually to the audience in terms of questions that you might have for the panel. Just announce who you are and your questions.
My name is Mark Redfern. I'm from Reading Council. I started a new role at Reading a couple of months ago as the social inclusion manager. My first job is coordinating the council's cost of living response. So please get in touch with me if you need anything else. Paul, I wanted to ask you around the obvious support that you give to your employees, them to be able to live well and be happy and content in their work and content in their lives. Do you see that they themselves are then sort of connecting out in their communities and doing things like volunteering or giving up their own time, those sorts of things, where they live?
Yeah, so I was going to mention that anyway, because Jonathan's brought up volunteering. So we introduced, I use the phrase compulsory volunteering, which doesn't sound right. But, so we did the same. Everyone has to do. Sounds a bit okay. So it sounds a bit forceful, but the thing is, I used to work for charitable sector anyway before I was in business, and I've seen the impact on my life through spending lots of time in Kenya. We've got a project over there which we take teams of people to, and everyone I take gets massively impacted. We help them for sure, but actually they help us probably more than we help them, just by the humility and the just seeing people who have absolutely nothing. So I've seen that in my life. So wanted to do some good in the community, and I also knew how much it impacts those people. So yes, we brought in this scheme, started with 12 hours a year, I think. It's now 16. So they do that, and most of that is like, well, not everyone's based in our field office, but most people are. And we do quite a bit with Send a Cow, which is a charity in Reading. And there was a bit of resistance to start with. 2 or 3 people said, no, not interested, don't want to do it. Well, come on, give it a go. And they did, and actually one of those people, they all did it, one of those people is now doing it every Saturday morning in her own time. So yeah, I think it's a really good point to make. People are enrich their lives, become better employees and better people through volunteering. So I'm all in favour of it, and we'll probably increase to 16 again next year.
Great.
Graham was at Ethical Reading. It's specific, I mean, because it's the effect of council tax. You mentioned various parts, but you didn't mention parts. Are they sympathetic, or they're still slapping?
So I think in Reading we're quite lucky because we, just before the pandemic hit, we signed the council tax protocol with Reading Borough Council. So I think Reading as a council is generally a fair bit more sympathetic towards council tax debt than most councils. But, national big picture, the councils do still have broad and quite harsh powers of enforcement for council tax. Excuse me. So, and certainly we know that there are local authorities across the country that do jump to, you've missed a payment, here's your final demand, if it's not with us in a week, you're going to court. And we've seen that in Reading in the past as well. We have quite good links with the recovery team in Reading Council, and I'm sure many of the other charities do as well. I think they're quite open to finding reasonable ways forward for people. I think the real difficulty going forward, again linked to cost of living, is if people don't have a way forward. it kind of forces their hand to a certain extent. You know, they have a legal duty to recover council tax where it's not paid. And they must do that. They only have very limited discretion and very limited resources in order to exercise discretion where money is paid towards their council tax bill out of the council's purse, essentially. So Reading as a whole, I would say, is quite good at the moment. I think we're less worried about it than we have been in previous years, just because we know we'll generally get good engagement out of the council about finding a way forward. But as I say, we have this huge number of people now coming forward with debt problems where there is no real solution, and there may not be a repayment offer on the table for all their council tax, and that can create some awkward situations. So we'll see how it goes, I think, over the coming years. And
I would just put on council tax. I think hasn't the council given, or the government's given businesses a lot of businesses great reduction of council tax they paid for the business rates they paid for the last few years. And so it's this inequality where they are giving to business and then cutting services like the CAB. You know, it's just a thing. But just a point of information, we talked about some tips. When you get it after 6 months or a year, is it backdated like tax? It is.
So it is backdated.
But some benefits aren't they? Are only from the date that you apply.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, without going into a quick lesson on all the benefits available. Yeah, so PIP would be backdated if an award is successful.
So when it was first
it would be backdated to when you first made the application.
So it's not, whereas if you do something on tax, you can backdate it before that, not from the date you apply. Just another inequality built into our system by the power.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question? This is I'm afraid this is very naive, this question, but so you might say, oh yeah, everybody knows the answer to that, but I don't know the answer to it. So I was struck by the idea that Shoosmiths would give every employee £1,000. But I know that many firms have lots of people working from home, and you mentioned that this is a policy that you think is a very good one that you see why. So just suppose, for the sake of argument, that I worked for you, and in fact, I was working 2 days a week from home. And so I was heating my office, I was running the electricity, I was paying for the internet, maybe I was paying for the phone as well. So I had quite a lot of actual business expenses at home those 2 days I'm working from. Admittedly, I'm not commuting, but just to sit outside. So here's the question coming. If Shoosmiths, instead of giving me the £1,000, which I'm going to presumably pay tax on, it gave me something towards the office expense for those 2 days I'm working home. After all, Shoosmiths could actually downsize its office space since it's got some fewer people coming in. It sounds to me like that would be preferable from both Shoosmiths' side, but also from the employee side.
Yeah. I don't think it's a naive question, if I could say that. And it's definitely something we looked at and we were considering. I think we need to look at it, and I'll perhaps take it away from Shoosmiths and say all employers, I think, in terms of whatever they're looking at, is probably a range of support. I mean, for example, on the £1,000, you know, there was some thought around, okay, why don't we link it to, you know, to make it a percentage-based increase, which is what we did back in May, reflecting back over the last financial year. And then the point that was made there was, one, you've done that already in respect to a percentage base, and two, of course, that does benefit the higher earners more, you know, proportionately in that respect. So the idea was a flat rate payment, and I agree, it is taxed, it is a taxable payment, so it had to be taxed. But it was felt that was a better way of doing it. We have looked at things like we will support people with, you know, systems at home, you know, screens at home, chairs at home, desks at home, that sort of thing. So that sort of thing is being provided to make a better workstation environment for them at home. I get on the costs, you know, electricity, heating, etc. The line at that on the moment is, there are other set-off costs that you don't have. So the commuting, for example, it's extraordinary. People were regularly in 5 days a week. They're now regularly in 2 days a week. That is actually a big saving for a lot of people on the travel. I think for all employers, the thing is be creative in what you can do, I think, is what I'm saying. Is it's not always just about the money in terms of the hard cash that might be handed over. And many businesses, I mean, the inflation at 10.1% yesterday, I hear, many businesses would say, well, we can't afford to pay a 10% salary increase. I completely understand that. So what else can the business do in order to support? And it may be the employee assistance, it may be the training and support on debt management and financial management and so on. It may be a range of things, but I take your point. We did look at it in terms of particular costs. We felt this was a different way because, of course, money has to be spent in certain ways and they have to allocate it, and that's how we did it. But I take the point that other businesses might choose a different line.
So on the did you consider doing that inversely proportional to people's wages? Bearing in mind people at the bottom are going to need a lot more.
And increase by percentage more.
So some of our top earners on the one we're doing, the leadership team, they've said don't need it.
Yeah.
It can go back in the pot. So did you?
And we've had, and there've been, we've had discussions about them, for example, on, that £1,000 payment, that is for employees only. So in other words, Shoosmiths is a partnership and the senior level are self-employed partners, including myself. And so we simply don't get that. It's for employees generally. But absolutely. I mean, that sort of creative thinking around targeting the benefit, those with the most requirement is definitely something that's in our mind. Yeah.
Why was it better to give £1,000 favour? Sorry, you're bitten us up. Sorry, no, that's a bit.
I don't mind being in the fire.
That's fine. Why is it better to give people £1,000 one-off payment? I think it's what you say. Rather than give people £1,000 pay rise, which goes on forever.
Yeah. So again, a range of things. So for example, the one-off payment was September. Our pay review is November. So this next month there will be, without prejudging it, we are. Well, people will still get substantial pay increases in November. Yeah. We will do that as well. Yeah. So it is both. Now, of course, we're a professional services firm. We're fortunate enough to have had, through the effort of our people, some real success in the last few years. And we can therefore distribute some of that financial success, and we will do so. But I appreciate there are other businesses out there that will be struggling significantly, and they need to perhaps look at other methods, not just financial, to support their people. That's what I was saying. But in terms of certainly for Shoosmiths, it is, yes, we did the one-off payment, but we're also doing the pay increases as well.
Yeah. I mean, I would just make a general point. It's this sort of idea all the business can't afford it, times are tough. But times were good. Businesses didn't give over generous payables. They didn't say, how much can we afford? We're making loads of profit. Let's give everyone a large payment. So there is an element.
Some of them did.
And if you've run a business well, you've made profits in the past. If times are tough, is it for the employees to absorb times are tough? And I think this goes with flexible working, 0 hours, everything transferring risk for the employees. Or is it for the business to pick up the slack or be the buffer and say yes, because you're saying you've made profits in the past and they're in the company, and so times might be harder, then you can afford to pay the cost of living increase when maybe the business can't afford it that year because times are tough. But when times were good, they perhaps they ethically should have been putting money aside to be able to support their employees through the tough times.
Yeah. I mean, this gets to
it's who picks up
the ideas like
risk.
Yeah, that's exactly what we've done. So yeah.
I mean, I think so the more socially conscious organisations, I suppose, have been doing that, and this we want to encourage that sort of thinking. Actually, Brad's question raised an interesting point in terms of challenges just to public face around energy costs. And there's this notion that Martin Lewis and various others have come up with, which is the notion of sort of warm hubs. And several sort of libraries have come forward and various other organisations in terms of saying, well, if there are people out there that can't afford to heat their homes, we'll provide you a space where you can come. And I was just thinking, as Brad was saying, because of hybrid working, of course, now there's a lot of space in offices. There's lying empty. Is this something that businesses could support the community with in terms of becoming warm hubs?
That's a good call, isn't it? Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. If you got the space. I mean, also for the, some employees might want to come in and work more in the office when it's really cold rather than paying for that. Funnily enough, actually, in that really hot weather, strangely, everyone was in the office with the air conditioning. So the opposite of that. But yeah, bigger companies that must have spare rooms, that would be fantastic impact on the community, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Is that something that Shoosmiths should look at?
I think we'd certainly consider it. Some of the issues that we have in again, I'm talking about different businesses and their sectors. We've looked at, for example, sharing space in similar ways, and the difficulties, some aspects of client confidentiality, the work that we do, there are some issues around that. But, I don't necessarily think that they'd be insurmountable. As Paul said, we're actually anticipating that we might have more employees in the office generally over the winter period for reasons like that. I mean, I find it incredible that in the UK we're talking about that people might come into their offices rather than stay at home and be cold. But it's possible. We're predicting that might happen over the course of the winter.
Interesting. I mean, I think if we could do that, like I said, it would help, particularly the people at the Sharp East End. That Fraser is out helping on a day-to-day basis. Oh, thank you very much. That's fantastic. Is there any sort of last questions from anyone?
Quick one from me.
Yep.
Nick Burley from Lichfields. We're a town planning consultancy, often coalface, dealing with housing crisis. I'm interested to hear from Fraser about your experience of how that plays out in your role. Do you end up helping people with desperate housing situations? And any of the other panellists, if they've got experiences or any insights into dealing with housing issues through their businesses or supporting their employees through housing issues, I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, housing's always been a big part of our service. It's something that we used to do a lot more of. We used to be at the courts, helping with possession hearings. That's something that unfortunately we lost during COVID, but we do still do a lot of the very sort of initial work on that sort of thing. So people first get their notice, for example, for eviction. It's quite a common one for us, and just kind of understanding what stage they are at the process, helping them understand what they should and shouldn't do. As you may know, there's certain things that you can do that seem like the right thing to do, but actually put you out of favour with the council and certain housing, homelessness support services that might be available and that sort of thing, just because of how the rules work around that particular area, which can be very complicated. I think we are starting to see new types of housing inquiry come through. I think something that's been a big growth has been landlords wanting to change the terms of tenancies part way through. That's something that's really started to pop up quite a lot recently. Perhaps unsurprisingly, those that include bills with the tenancy. Landlords are quite keen not to be on the hook for those, or to change the rate at which they charge rent to cover some of the additional costs, or to move it up onto the tenant themselves. For perfectly understandable reasons. The whole property itself may well be at risk if those costs aren't covered somewhere. It's not a straightforward situation. So that's something that we're starting to see a lot of. Obviously, in recent weeks, we've had mortgage crisis as part of a subset of the cost of living crisis, and again small private landlords are feeling that really hard, and it's their tenants as well, it's their homes that are the ones that are at risk as a result of that. So I mean there's a huge amount of work around housing, not just those particular examples, but it's tougher for everyone. Housing associations are having to cut costs, for example. Councils having to cut costs in certain areas and provide additional support with fewer resources, which is something we're all very familiar with. It's the perfect storm that Gertrude talked about earlier. It's, all of these things happening at once means that housing issues that perhaps used to be quite straightforward, it's, okay, this is how this eviction's going. But, if worst case scenario will help you to understand what you can find elsewhere, well, that's less of an option now as well, because it's so much more competitive, because there's so much more of all of this happening, and rents are increasing at the same time. So it's just compounding all of those effects. So that's certainly something we're seeing.
I've got one practical thing, just meant to mention earlier. There's various payroll apps now that put it completely in the employees' hands in terms of their money. So there's one called Pay Captain we use. Helps people manage the money. They can move money into different accounts on when the money comes in. They can also they can get a £200 advance on their wages. No one knows about this apart from them. And we can get a report, but we don't. So that's been a really good thing for the lower paid people in our business.
And that's just part of the
they do all your payroll for you, but the employee has an app on the phone and sorts it all out.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
it's really helpful. Well, brilliant. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our brilliant panellists.
It and see you.
Ideas and thoughts there. So I just wanted to finish off with there we go. Excellent. So just a couple of upcoming events which we'd be delighted if you could join us. So we've got the Ethical Readings Community Forum. That's for our partners, supporters, volunteers, invited guests. The attendance leader. It was just across the way. Fantastic space. We'd love for you to join us for that. And also coming up on the 22nd of Reading is we're working with a number of businesses, including Reader, and putting together our very first Reading Climate Fair. The time for action around the climate is now. And so what we want to do is to actually provide the tools, the education resources for businesses in particular to take that first step. So go to our website, have a look at those, and do sign up. And other than that, just get involved in what we do. So that's our website there. You can go to our website, sign up as a member, and you'll be on the mailing list. We've got a number of programs around well-being, business ethics, sustainability. The example there is we're planting trees in the private neighbourhoods in the city schools. So do connect with us, become part of the community. Thank you very much.